Good to have you here. Let me just start. I wasn't going to do this, but I'm going to do it anyway. I don't care. Like the last 6 weeks, I've told you, we became grandparents, our first grandkid. It's been great, but our daughters had quite a bit of hospital visits and ER visits and hospital stays and some sickness going on. So we've been in charge of a grandkid for like this whole past 3 weeks and this last week. So I don't know what's going to come out of my mouth today. So it took me a little while to get my message together. Didn't finish it up till last night. I don't know if it's coherent. So if you're brand new, give us one more week, all right? Hopefully next week we'll be back to normal. But anyway, 2015, there was a study that was done in the UK to see how university students responded to smelly, sweaty t-shirts, okay? So they had one set of these sweaty, smelly, stinky t-shirts from the school that these students went to, and then they had another set that were from rival schools, and they wanted to see what kind of feedback they would get. Well, the researchers found that students were less put off by t-shirts they thought had been worn by students from their school, right? The reason being, they thought like, hey, we are on this team together. But the other part was that they were reluctant to show grace to the same people or to people from other schools that had these same stinky, sweaty t-shirts. Now, we're talking about sweaty t-shirts here, right? But if you think about that division that is there, I mean, it's really a microcosm for where we are in our world today. Is it any wonder that we are so divided? Ed Stetzer, in his book, Christians in the Age of Outrage, said this: unflinching devotion to a tribe not only pushes us to fight against issues that are not connected to the gospel and don't advance the mission of God, but it also affects how we view others who disagree with us. Wouldn't it be great during this political season that we find ourselves in right now that we could be unified even in our differences? And so we've been asking this question throughout this series: can I put my faith filter ahead of my political filter? Can I separate my faith filter from my political filter? And so we've been looking at that question and asking ourselves that throughout this series. Well, today, as we finish the series Undivided, we're going to talk about unity. But let me kind of do a recap from where we've been if you're brand new today. The first week, we talked about being civil. Can we be civil towards people that we have differences with? We actually went back to James. James talked about being quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. It was like, hey, there's a great process for us to be civil towards other people, especially those we have differences with. The second week, we talked about showing dignity. We said all of us, all humanity, we are all created in the image of God. And so if everybody's created in the image of God, everybody deserves our dignity. And then last week, we talked about being people of humility. We said, look, if you're a follower of Christ and Christ is in you, then we are called to be humble toward those who may be different than us. But like I said, today we're going to talk about unity. And I think sometimes we hear that word unity, we probably think uniformity. Unity and uniformity are actually two different things. Uniformity means sameness. There's this consistency that's throughout. Unity means harmony. It means together as one. And so can we hold different political views and not be uniform? Because too often we have similar political views, and what do? We become uniform like the people around us. Can we be different, right? Can we hold these different political views and actually be unified? Well, what brings us to this place? How do we become people that are divided and not united? Well, it really begins with something known as the fundamental attribution error. This says the tendency for observers to attribute other people's behavior to internal or dispositional factors and to downplay situational causes. That clears everything up for us, right? We're good. We don't need to... Yeah. Let me put it more plainly. This is a bias that causes us to attribute people's behaviors to their character. So we make assumptions about people by what they say, what they look like, the actions that they take, but we don't know anything about them. We don't know about their social background, environmental background. We don't know about their past experiences. We don't know about their present experiences. We make assumptions on very, very little bit of information. And usually those assumptions are negative. When you pull up to a stoplight here in our area and you see someone who is asking for help, where do your assumptions go? Many times we look at them and think, addict, lazy, manipulative. Now, there may be some truth in that for some people, but it also could be they lost their job and they're just trying to survive in the moment. Or maybe this week you had a meeting at work and people or somebody showed up late and your assumptions about that person is irresponsible, immature, and that could be true, but the reality may have been that they blew out a tire on the way to work that morning. Or maybe they had childcare issues and were trying to figure that out. We make assumptions about people and we define them by a little bit of information. But we do this all the time, even in the world of politics. Maybe you think all Republicans are redneck, red Solo cup drinking, gun-toting evangelicals, right? Maybe you think Democrats are arrogant, tax-loving, Birkenstock-wearing socialists. Maybe you think independents are conflict-avoiding, weed-smoking, Prius-driving vegans, right? And somebody probably got offended by what I just said there. We do have a complaint department here. We do. Joel at thejourneynova.org. He is ready to listen to all complaints. This is what we do, right? We define people by these assumptions that we make based on what they say, what they write, how they vote, and we don't take in consideration who they really are. We don't take in consideration that past experiences, the present experiences, their environment growing up, the backgrounds that they've had, the upbringing that they experienced in their homes. And so we make assumptions about them on very little information. We don't really know them. What do these assumptions lead to? They lead to what is known as this culture of contempt. Because we make these assumptions about people, it's always in a negative light, right? And so now they have become a threat, they have become an obstacle to us, they have become an object. And so when you don't believe like me, act like me, think like me, vote like me, I make you my enemy. We've talked about this before in this series. We feel like we have to have an enemy, and so we make people our enemies. And that means I'm putting my ideologies, my views, my opinions, my politics first. I don't really want to understand yours. We can talk, but we're going to fight. But in the end, I'm going to see you as this obstacle and this threat. And so this leads to the anger that we find, the disgust that we feel like we may have towards other people, the contempt that we see all around us. But why is this our culture today? Why do we see so much division? Why do we see so much contempt? And here's even the bigger question. Why do we see it so often in those of us who say we're followers of Jesus? Followers of Jesus for centuries held their identity in one thing. It was rooted in their faith. Over the last, not quite 100 years, but sometime in this time frame, we've lost that identity. What's caused that for us? Many different things. Our desire for success, sort of the me culture, our self-indulgences. And so if we think about ourselves, those have become the identities that we hold on to. Now we throw in our current political world that we live in, and our identity is not in Jesus anymore. Our identity is in a political platform, a political party, a politician. That has become our identity. God and faith may still be important to us, but it's not our identity anymore. It has moved to something else. And when God, when faith, when Jesus is not our main identity, we've got to find something to identify with, right? And so that's why we end up identifying with the things that we do. Maybe it's an issue that we feel pretty strongly again about, and that has become our identity. Well, what happens when someone comes to you and they criticizes you for your stance on that issue? Think about what takes place at that point. Because this thing is now my identity, when they criticize me for believing something, I don't see this as an attack on the issue, it's an attack on me. And so it's not about let's talk through this issue, it's about this personal attack on me. And it's all because my identity has become anchored in whatever that issue may be. And I'll say this once again, even for those of us who say we follow Jesus. So what we see happening is that partisanship has risen while Christianity has declined. We are being more spiritually formed by our culture than we are by Jesus. And like I just said, platforms and people and politicians, they have become our identity. And when that becomes our identity, and that's the thing we focus on, we become less identified with Jesus. And when we're less identified with Jesus, we end up adding to the division around us. But there's something pretty crazy about the Bible and about Jesus. He had a pulse on this about 2,000 years ago. It's the Last Supper. He's getting ready to be arrested and executed. And he is there with his disciples, and he prays this prayer that we find in John chapter 17. And this prayer is about unity. It starts in verse 9. It says, "My prayer is not for the world, but for those you have given me, because they belong to you. All who are mine belong to you, and you have given them to me, so they bring me glory." There are actually three parts to this prayer. We didn't read the very first part of the prayer. The first part of the prayer is Jesus praying for himself and things he's getting ready to experience. The second part of the prayer is what we're reading right here, and this is directed for or towards his disciples. And as he's praying this, he's praying towards the 11 that are left, because Judas at this point has gone to betray Jesus. Look at verse 11. "Now I am departing from the world. They are staying in this world, but I am coming to you. Holy Father, you have given me your name. Now protect them by the power of your name, so that they will be united just as we are." I want you to think about the culture those disciples grew up in. Again, we've talked about this in this series. They did not divide or could not separate their faith filter from their political filter. It was intertwined and very strongly intertwined, to such a point, I would even say, even though they would say God was important, God wasn't as important as the politics of the Jewish faith at that particular time. And so if you did not carry that specific identity, you were an outsider, you were an outcast. There were hostilities that would come your way. It was kind of like cancel culture before cancel culture was cool, right? But here's Jesus, and he prays this prayer. He says, "God, watch over them. God, protect them. When things are tough for them, don't let them fall back into their old ways. Keep them together. Keep them united." God, just like you and I are united as one. But if you think about these disciples, Jesus shows up into their life and he changes them. He transforms them. They have this new identity, right? This new identity they have is through Christ. And so he's praying this prayer that new identity would keep them together. Because I think Jesus knows that this oneness that he's experienced with them over these last 3+ years, he knows that once he's gone physically, that very quickly that oneness could leave. And so he's praying for the disciples that he's with them. But there's another part to this prayer. Move on down to verse 20. It says, "I am praying not only for these disciples, but also for all who will ever believe in me through their message." So here's Jesus, prayed for himself, prays for his disciples, but then he prays for future disciples. In this prayer, he's praying for the disciples, the followers of Christ we see in Acts, and the ones that we see in Paul's letters to the churches and the Christians that he wrote to. But he's also talking about us today. Here we are 2,000 years later, and Jesus was praying for us then. Well, what is Jesus' prayer? Look at the first part of verse 21. "I pray that they will all be one, just as you and I are one, as you are in me, Father, and I am in you." The Greek word that we see here for all is the word pas, and we actually see it a couple times in verse 20, here in verse 21. That word, the Greek word that is used there for all, means all, okay? Like that's what it means. It means 100%. It means every. So Jesus' prayer here is that all, that 100% of his followers will be hateful, will be angry, will be divided. That's not what he prays, is it? He says, "I pray that they would all be one, like you and I are one." William Barclay, in his commentary on John, says this about this prayer. He says, "The cause of Christian unity at the present time, and indeed all through history, has been injured and hindered because people love their own religious organizations, their own creeds, their own ritual more than they loved each other. It is more natural for human beings to be divided than to be united. It is more human for them to fly apart than to come together. So sometimes we think to be unified, we kind of go back to that word uniformity, right? We think all churches must look the same, believe the same, function the same. And I think that's sometimes where we get stuck and where we become disunified, where we see this disunity take place. Listen, if that's what you think, understand this: Christians will never organize their churches in the same way. We will never worship God in the same way. Our methodologies will be different. We will never believe precisely the same thing. That's why there are about 3,500 different denominations in the United States today, and I think they're all on Franconia Road here, right? What does Jesus pray here? He says, even in our differences, we are one. No matter our political party, Democrat, Republican, Libertarian, Socialist, no matter the color of our skin, maybe you remember the song, red, yellow, black, and white, no matter our ethnicity, Latino, European, Asian, African, Apache, Kurd, no matter our income level, no matter the football team we support, no matter your Google Maps versus Apple Maps, whatever it may be for you, no matter what, Jesus says, if they follow me, may they be united, may they be together, may they be one. And the only way that we can do that is if we find our identity through Christ. But why is this oneness so important to Jesus? I mean, you hear that and you're like, oh, that feels good. Let's just all get together and have a big hug, right? That's not this feeling thing. There's something more important to this. There is a purpose for this oneness. There's this purpose for this unity. There's the purpose of Jesus' mission. Look at the rest of verse 21. Jesus prays, and may they be in us so that the world will believe you sent me. Here's Jesus who's praying for his followers to be one, who's praying for his followers to be together, who's praying for his followers to be united. Not so that we can have big churches, not so we can have great kids programs, not so we can have a bunch of people in small groups. He prays this prayer so that the world will believe that you sent me. That those of us who say, hey, well, I'm a follower of Jesus, then we will be unified even in our differences. So the world around us will see that and say, hey, there's something about you that somehow you are not uniform. There's some differences there, but you still love each other. You still care for each other. You are unified. And in that, this mission of Jesus to have more and more people meet and know and follow Jesus will come to fruition. Again, that all sounds great, but I'm afraid for many people who say they follow Jesus, we think that mission of Jesus is optional. I want to go back to that book by Ed Stetzer, Christians in the Age of Outrage. He said this. He said, of course, mission in the age of outrage is wholly different from that in past generations. There's no denying that when we see yelling, anger, and vitriol on the screens, the passion to share and show the love of Jesus can become muted. When it seems like everyone is so easily offended by everything, how do we evangelize? How do we care for others when people see us as uncaring? We may still believe mission is mandatory, but it's no wonder we function as if this is no longer true. It's a tricky time, but the mission is still the mission. If you and I say, hey, I'm a follower of Jesus, the mission of Jesus is not optional. But if your identity is found in something else, then, hey, guess what? The mission of Jesus is optional because you've chosen something else to be your mission. And again, we're talking about politics and faith and relationships and Jesus and ourselves in this. And so maybe it's politics, maybe it's work, maybe it's our kids. There's something that we have said, this is where my identity is going to be. And when we do that and we say, this is my identity, we'll see the mission of Jesus as optional. And Jesus says, no, I'm your identity. And because I'm your identity, there's this mission for you to live out. And this mission is that you love each other in such a way that the world will see that and want to come to know me too. That's why we do groups the way we do here at The Journey. First, we do groups because this is one of the loneliest places in the United States. I've used this stat a couple times this year. Washington, D.C. is the number one loneliest city in the United States. Alexandria, Virginia is the number 8 loneliest city in the United States. We do groups here at The Journey because circles are greater than rows. Yeah, it's weird to look upside down at this. Circles being groups for us. Rows is what we're experiencing here, but you can't build a relationship in this space. But in our circles, we can. In our connections with other people through our groups, we can do that. We've got great groups. If you have our Journey Church app, you can pop it open. Down at the bottom, it says groups. We have affinity groups. We've got 7 of those. So if you're maybe someone who is single or a young adult or a foodie, if you're a mom, if you're a lady, if you're a guy, we've got groups for you. And these are some great groups that we have that meet throughout the week. Part of that is we want you to build relationships with people in this space, right? And in those groups, there's a lot of commonality there. There's differences, but there's a lot of commonality. But the other part that we really want people to jump into is our neighborhood groups. And again, you can find that on the app or the QR code in front of you this morning. I think we have 21 neighborhood groups this fall. But we don't want these groups to be, if you live in Burke, to try to be in a group over in Alexandria. It's hard to do. We want these to be about proximity. So if you live in Lorton, you're with people that live in the Lorton area. If you live over in Rose Hill, you're with people that live over in the Rose Hill area. These groups are about proximity. It's about relationships, but I think it's even more so about our differences. If you look around this church, we're a pretty diverse church. Now, maybe you've gone to a church that's much more diverse than us, but I don't know if you know this. Like, this is a very, very diverse church here at The Journey, and we love that about this place. We want our groups to look like the diversity in our community. We want our groups to look like the diversity in this space on a Sunday morning. We're diverse socially, economically, ethnically, politically. And so we want you in groups where people are in different stages of life, having different experiences in life, come from different backgrounds in life. From like college students to the single mom, to the divorced dad, to the young couple, to grandparents, which I realized this week I get to be the voice of the grandparent in my group from now on for the rest of the fall, which is weird. I've said this many times. I thought you were supposed to be like 75 before you became a grandparent, but anyway. But like that's the power of our groups, that we're not homogeneous. We are different people, and we have different ideas and different views, but we're brought together because of Jesus. And maybe you've got questions about groups. If you haven't signed up for groups, we've got people out underneath the tent. They would love to answer any questions you may have about that. But in our differences, can we be unified as one? Well, yeah, we can. And the reason is because of Jesus. Now, I'm not just saying this because that's what we desire, right? It is what we desire. But we actually see Jesus plays this out with his disciples. His disciples, they weren't all the same. They didn't think alike. They didn't have the same views. Even politically, they were different. I mean, look at Jesus' lineup for his disciples. He had 4 fishermen. They probably ran a fishing business together. Andrew, Peter, James, and John. There were 2 other guys that were probably fishermen. Thomas, we know him as the doubter. Bartholomew, again, probably a fisherman. We have 3 tradesmen. We have James the younger, Thaddeus, and Philip. We have a zealot, a guy named Simon. He was a terrorist. He was trying to create anarchy within Jerusalem and within Israel because he was trying to get rid of the Roman occupation. We have a tax collector, Matthew. What did he do? Well, basically he extorted money from people. So he was hated in that day. Then we have a betrayer, of course, or an embezzler would probably be a good way to define Judas himself. So if we look at these guys that Jesus picks to follow him and that follow him for these 3+ years, they are very different than each other. But what brought them together? Their identity through Christ. That unity that was there. I get Judas, he's a little bit of an outlier there, but there's this connection that is there. And because of this unity they had, what did they do after Jesus left? They lived out the mission of Jesus. And you and I, we are here in this place today because they were unified and they lived out the mission of Jesus. But when I hold tight to my views, my opinions, my beliefs, my politics, when those things take over and when those things are my identity, it can begin to break apart the relationships I have. And so in groups, we desire that you are together with people who are different than you, that think differently than you. So when they bring up something political, because you're just having a conversation, you don't get mad and angry and stomp out and never talk to them again and never come back. It's not how this works. And yet that's sort of the method that we take. By the way, if that's what you do or you've done that in life, that shows you where your identity is. No, we can have healthy conversations with people who are different than us, who see life differently than we do, who vote differently than we do. That even in our differences, when Jesus is our focus, we can be unified together, living out the mission of Jesus in this world. I love what N.T. Wright writes in his book, Surprised by Hope. He said, left to ourselves, we lapse into a kind of collusion with entropy, acquiescent in the general belief that things may be getting worse, but that there's nothing much we can do about them. And we're wrong. Our task in the present is to live as resurrection people in between Easter and the final day with our Christian life, corporate and individual, in both worship and mission, as a sign of the first and a foretaste of the second. These are the type of people that we are called to be if we say we follow Jesus. Am I willing to move above the noise of political argument and point people to Jesus? Hear me out. Voting matters. Voting is important. Hold on to that loosely. Because when you get to heaven, nobody's going to be standing there saying, hey, how did you vote in the 2024 presidential election? Oh, well, you can't come in today, because that's not a question that is asked. What's going to be asked is, who were you? What kind of person were you on this earth? Were you a divider, or did you bring unity around you? Were you able to separate your faith filter from your political filter? Are we able to do that? Can we find unity with others? Can we live out the mission of Jesus when we really live in a politically charged environment today? Can we do that? Well, let me leave with you a couple of ideas that I think can help us do that well as we head into this rest of this political season. I think there's a question that all of us have to answer, and the question is, where do I find my identity? That's a big question, but we all have to answer this question. Do I find it in success? Do I find it in a job title? Do I find it in an income? Do I find it through my kids? Do I find it through politics? Or do I find my identity in Jesus? Go back to the prayer, verse 22. Jesus says, I have given them the glory you gave me, so they may be one as we are one. I am in them and you are in me. May they experience such perfect unity that the world will know that you sent me and that you love them as much as you love me. Jesus says, I am in them. Their identity is in me. And together, if that's the case, then they can experience unity. And through that unity, the world will know that you sent me. Vote for who you want to vote for. Support the party that you want to support, but don't let that be your identity. Let your identity be in Jesus. And so all of us, I think, have to answer that question. Where do I find my identity? But then I think we have to, some of us need to go and ask for forgiveness. We haven't really talked about this in this series yet, but I thought today, as we talk about unity, this might be a big deal for some of us. If your identity has been in politics and not in Jesus, chances are, go back to that Greek word, 100%, that you have hurt somebody, you have offended somebody, that you more than likely have broken a relationship with somebody that you care for, right? Because of this disagreement, there's been anger, there's been contempt, there's been bitterness, there's been hate that maybe has been showered on someone else. And that person, maybe a family member, that relationship is broken because of your differences in politics. Or maybe you have a close friend that you haven't talked to in so long because that relationship has been torn apart because of differences in your views on politics. Maybe you have coworkers that you try to ignore as much as you can because you don't see eye to eye when it comes to politics. And so it's very likely there's someone in your life is politics has been your identity and not Jesus, where you have said things, where you have done things, where you have reacted in certain ways due to these differences that you have in politics, and that relationship is ended. I'll tell you something that I believe. I think the most important thing you can do in this election season is not to vote. I think the most important thing you may have to do in this election season is go and ask for forgiveness. To go to that person and say, I messed up. Can you forgive me? And don't just say that. Be specific. You learn that in counseling. You don't just say, hey, forgive me. That could be anything. You say, hey, please forgive me for these words I said to you, or this thing I did, or the way I reacted when we were having this conversation. Will you forgive me for what I did? For some of us, this will be the greatest thing that we will do in this political season, to try to bring unity, to try to heal this broken relationship. Now hear me out. And again, you learn this in counseling. How they respond, hey, that is all on them. You're saying, I'm going to take this step. I'm going to be mature. I'm going to let my identity be in Christ in such a way. I'm going to ask for this forgiveness. And how they respond back to you, that's on them. They may say, thank you. I've been waiting for this day. I love you. Let's repair this relationship. They may say, thank you. I appreciate this. I'll take that forgiveness that you're asking for. I'll give that to you, but I'm going to need a little time. They may hear you say that, and they may say a bunch of words I can't say right now in front of you, right? But that's on them. That's not on you. You've taken this step to say, hey, I'm sorry. Will you forgive me? And when we take that step, guess what it brings? It brings oneness. It brings togetherness. It brings unity. And for some of us, maybe that's the greatest thing we're going to do in this political season. But then the last thing I would say is pray for God to change you. I don't put this one last because it's not that important. I put this last because I really want us to leave with this thought that maybe the important thing that we need to do in our life is to start with prayer, to pray for unity, to pray that our identity is found first in Jesus. For some of us that are followers of Christ, maybe that's the reminder we need today, that well, you know what? I'm allowing my views, I'm allowing my politics, I'm allowing my work, I'm allowing my success to become my identity. But that's not what I'm called to. That's a secondary thing. I'm called to find my identity in Christ. And maybe for some of us, that's the reminder we need as we head into the season. Maybe for others, maybe you need to find that identity. Maybe you're like, hey, I don't have that identity in Christ. What do I do? Well, we talk a lot about baptism here at The Journey. We had Meredith was baptized in our first service. Leah's getting baptized in our next service. We've got like 5 to 7 people who are going to be baptized here in the next couple of weeks. And these are people saying, hey, I want to fully find my identity in the spiritual journey that I am on through Jesus. And they're taking that step in their life. Maybe that's where you are too. If it is, we'd love to hear from you. You can hit that QR code there or the connection card on the app or the QR code and like, hey, I want to talk about this. Maybe you're here today, the water's warm. We will dunk you today when we finish today. Just let us know. I'm being serious. We get clothes you can change into. But maybe for some of us, it's finding that identity through Christ. And that should be our prayer. Pray for empathy and direction and wisdom and guidance in the conversations you're having. Because we still got a few weeks until this election happens, right? And we're going to be talking to a lot of people, and more than likely, they're going to be different opinions than we have. Pray for God's guidance in those conversations. Pray for unity in your relationships, your family, your friends, your coworkers. That, again, it's so important that those relationships come first to us. And then lastly, I would say pray for unity with other followers of Jesus, even in our differences. Like that was that prayer Jesus prayed. Let them be one. And he's like, I know they're different, right? Jesus knows his disciples are different. He knows that we are different. Let them be one. Let them be together. Let them be unified so that the world will know you sent me. Our mission is critical, and the outcome is eternal. And that's why unity is such a big deal to Jesus and to God, and it should be for us. And prayer is one of those ways we can set our hearts in such a way to be unified. Hey, look, we know the church isn't perfect. And maybe you're new here and you're like, hey, we think this might be the perfect church. We are not the perfect church, okay? We're a bunch of imperfect people serving a perfect Savior, and we don't have it all figured out, but I will let you know our focus here is Jesus. Vote how you want to vote. Support the political party you want to support. Be behind the candidate that you want to be behind. Give money to those candidates, parties, platform, whatever you want to do. That is a part of living in the United States. It's something great that we get to do, but in the end, that's not our identity. Our identity should be in Jesus Christ. And when we're focused on that and we're living that out in our lives, and people see that around us because of the unconditional love that we have for each other, more and more people will meet and know and follow Jesus. And we get there by being civil. We get there by showing dignity. We get there by being humble people. And in the end, we can be unified because we are identified through Christ. I hope you will take this series with you and, like me, do everything you can to live it out. I think the world depends on it. We can have our differences, but in the end, I can tell you what's most important is that more and more people get to meet Jesus.